border faster. Boom, going to the max. No, I'm going to the max. No, I'm going to the max.
What's up, Philippines?
So let's freaking go.
Oh man, you guys are awesome. So I've been to 29 of these things in the last 3 years. This is by far the most organized and just like energetic, kind communities I've ever been to. So I'm happy to be here for the first time in Manila and look forward to dumping about 8 gigabytes worth of insights in an 8 megabyte block in the next 19 minutes and 28 seconds. So slides, we'll dive right in. By show of hands while I'm doing that, how many of you are not from Manila? Pretty amazing. Who came from Europe? Europe's in the house, all right. Eastern Europe? Awesome. Lithuania, I lived in the Estonia for a while. Can we have my slides, guys? Oh, Latvia, yeah. I flew through your airport. Who came from the States? All right, couple US, all right. And how about somewhere else from Asia, some Tokyo, Japan, Korea? I know we have a lot of Korea, right? All right. How are we doing on the... Oh, there we go. All right, let's drive right in. So, 8 forces that are impacting Web3 innovation. It's important, I always disclose my bias up front. I hate when I listen to speakers and I'm listening to their ideas, but I don't really understand where they're coming from. So I like to disclose my bias up front. It's been shaped and molded over the last 23 years with hundreds of books, thousands of meetings. I can't even count how many companies, multiple exits, and a couple of really tough failures along the way. And so here's what my bias looks like kind of in summary. If you haven't read books like The Fourth Turning, or Watchman's Rattle, or Technology vs. Humanity, I recommend you take a screenshot of this. It's my cheat sheet. I don't recommend or promote a lot of books, but these 5 or 6 or 7 will fundamentally, I think, give you a rounded context for what you're in, what you're living in, and what you're going to be living to. So that's the bias. Let's talk about where we're going. So history rhymes. Web 1, many of us may not been in our professional careers then, but for those of us who were, Web 1 was the read-only web. So when we hear all these terms, Web 1, Web 3, Web 2, whatever, let's talk about the utility. So the utility in Web 1 was read-only, meaning we could democratize access to information. We could put it up on the web and for the first time remove what was called walled gardens, where there had been silos that had trapped information from certain people or from the masses. And Web 1's promise was right, and it inspired what we call the information age. The problem with Web 1 was, other than hypertext protocol, which HTTP, which made things clickable, and we could now go to things like Yahoo or portals like Ask Jeeves or Dogpile, for those who remember those, before Google, we basically were able to click through to stuff, but there was no real context, there was no relevance, there was none of that. So when we went into Web 2, it became the read-write web. This was the user-generated content era that we've now all lived in, and many of you grew up and built careers in thus far. The problem with Web 2 was what? Who knows what the problem with Web 2 was? All right, we're going to speed up for the sake of time. The problem with Web 2 was we built bigger walled gardens than ever before. So if you think about the promise of Web 1, it was to rip down walled gardens and democratize access to information and capital flows and things like that. And Web 2 was the only way we could survive after the dot-com crash, where we had no business model. Web 2 went back to an advertising, essentially attention-based CPM business model across the board. So whether it was Google or whether it was Facebook or Apple or any of these large tech companies, data became the new uranium. A lot of times you'll hear data is oil, but I believe data is the new uranium because it's like a tool and a weapon. So what's Web 3? If Web 2 was read-write, where we could go back and forth, but none of us owned our platform, Web 3 is where we execute in real time on the platform that we own at an individual level. Does that make sense? So that's the vision of where we're heading. So what is the role that the macro environment plays into this? For those who aren't familiar with Edelman's Trust Barometer, every single year they put out kind of the state of trust. In 2020, their headline for their report was "Trust is Bankrupt." For 2022, this just came out. I encourage you to read it. Distrust is the default. How many can relate to that? Like right now, you're like, I don't trust this guy. I don't like the way he looks. I don't know why he's wearing sneakers with a suit, right? Distrust is our new default. And that's kind of just where we are. So again, when you read books like The Fourth Turning, which came out in 1997, it talks about the cyclical nature of history, and it talks about generational archetypes. And depending on when we're born during a period of time. We're either building up an institution or we're watching one degrade or be torn down. And there's 4 cycles we don't have time to get into, but the fourth turning is called the crisis. And it's a 20-25-year period that we are now in as of 05. And so it'll end somewhere around 2030, and then we'll move into, hopefully, what they call the new high. And the new high would be like summer or spring. Spring. And what that means is that we get to a point where the last 100 years worth of institutional infrastructure and society's norms are not only threatened and challenged, and disrupted, but they literally crumble down. And then they're replaced over a period of 10 years during the end of the crisis with what would be the new systems. So here's how I like to say that in layman's terms. The cement on the future has been poured, but it's still wet. You and I could put our fingerprints in it. Now, if that doesn't get you out of bed every morning, nothing will. All right, why? Because under 39, there's almost 4 billion people on this rock. Think about that. 3.9 billion people under the age of 39. Are they digitally native? Yes. Right? Do they want friction? No. Are they global? Absolutely. We just proved that when we raised our hands and said where we were all from. So Gen Z's values, and Gen Z is, just one category of that 3.9 billion, but if you look Gen X, Y, Z, right, those my age and under, the mobility, connectivity, and community values are totally different in Gen Z than they were in any prior generation. What that means is they value mobility above all else. They don't want to be told where they can live, where they can work. They want to do whatever they want to do. So therefore, connectivity is their second value, because as long as they're connected, they can do that. And community. We had the me generation in the 60s. We now have the we generation. And when you think about those forces, it'll impact the way you and I deal with our customer. And I wrote a book in 2017 with a guy named Travis Wright, who's my co-author and a really well-known podcaster with Bad Crypto Podcast and Nifty Show. He and I have been working together for years. And we wrote a book called Digital Sense. And it was all about putting the customer in the center of every decision that your business makes. So whether you're a large enterprise or a startup. And this phrase of the customer is the asset is not something I encourage you to take lightly. The customer is the only thing that makes our business valuable. Our customer experience is the only competitive differentiator we have, because we've already proven through globalization somebody else can make it cheaper somewhere else in the world. So no matter what it is, if Bank A invents a new product, by the next morning, 58 other banks have copied it, knocked it off, and sold the same thing. Everything has been commoditized, but the one thing that you and I can have that can be proprietary, that is not commoditizable, is our customer experience. And great brands have done this, but how do you do it? So we built a framework and an operating system for brands to use that looked at things like forces. But here's what Web3 visualized in my world looks like, because a lot of times we hear about Web3, we get confused with blockchain and NFTs and where it all fits. So if you think about the open metaverse as 3-dimensional spatial websites, right now you have 2-dimensional read-write websites. That's what we know as Web 2. A metaverse, an open metaverse, is a bunch of 3-dimensional spatialized websites. And they're all connected into that new web. And at the center of that is user identity. We had a company in the portfolio a couple years ago that was building a mobile phone that was providing privacy as a choice. And choice was the key term, because we live in a time where we won't have much choice in 10 years. If you understand the exponential growth of AI and other things like it, the reality is that when I ask people, do they own their device or does it own them, it makes them think, because for a minute, you and I have to go, wait a minute, I paid $1,400 US or whatever it was for my iPhone, but what's the first thing you have to do to turn it on? Anybody know? You have to create a what? An Apple ID, a profile. Now, think about that, an Apple ID. So who owns that? Apple. So wait a minute, I paid $1,400 to have my identity stolen by Apple. Now, I'm not knocking Apple. I'm saying that business model, guys, is fragile. More fragile than people think. Because whether mass consumers are yet aware of how much they have been harvested, or whether they ever care, the reality is none of us are going backwards. We're not going to get rid of this tracking device that's one step away from a chip in our brain, because we can't. We don't know how to function without it. But what we can do is we can make it better. And part of making it better doesn't mean changing the device at all. It changes how we take ownership of that device. Who has the proxy over the data and therefore the assets, the digital assets that we consume? 78% of Gen Z will leave a brand if they're not on the right channels. Now, it doesn't matter whether that's TikTok today or something we haven't heard of tomorrow. The reality is that Web3, your very product, your brand, will live in two worlds. It'll have the in real life physical world, feel, taste, touch, smell, right, that we can use our 5 senses, and then you'll have a digital representation. We will arbitrage bits and atoms. We will tokenize everything, right? So the metaverse is predicted by McKinsey and others to be anywhere between 5 to 13 trillion. The last couple of weeks have been rough in the crypto world, but mostly for the centralized finance side and for the understanding of people going, it's all bad. But the reality is you're not stopping this train, and billions of dollars is being invested in it. And so the question is what am I building and with who now? And that's where I think the Philippines has a phenomenal opportunity. Open source, open standards, innovation, they will become core tenets of this. Flow versus friction, right? We talked about that. If you haven't read a book by Parag Khanna, it was on the list. It's called Connectography. It's one of the best books I've read in the last 20 years. It talks about how the connection points of flows, capital, talent, communities, versus borders are the new power center. Who's connected to whom and at what cost and at what value and what's the medium of exchange? So everything from dark fiber and T1 connections all the way to digital assets moving through it. So as we get to a world of flow versus friction, and as we start to see that this combinatorial, as Gerd Leonhard says, which is a combination of multiple foundational new technologies, blockchain, AI, IoT, all those, the new biomedical stuff. As we get to this world where data is now not something that we live with, but that we live within, then we can see why infrastructure and app layer opportunities are abundant at minimum. So first thing to remember is this. I like to give you guys some things to take away because, I talk fast and I barf a lot of stuff at you. Culture always comes first. Think about that for a minute. Culture always comes first. How many of you have heard of Silicon Valley? How many of you know the actual story of how Silicon Valley happened? Most people don't. But here's what's more important than that. Before the first venture fund in 1975 was formed in Silicon Valley, right, there was Haight-Ashbury. For those who have studied culture, the cultural revolution of the 60s, the hippies, right, happened in Haight-Ashbury. Nerds follow cool people and vice versa, right? And now nerds are the new cool people. But the reality is culture will always comes first. So this deepening of culture, this understanding of diversity, these aren't like things that we should look at as, just SDGs or things that matter because, the G20 says so or because I'm supposed to say so. It's because they're good business. Cognitive diversity and cultural diversity are the only thing that allows you to understand your customer. And it's more important than ever that as brands, we seek to understand our customer versus to be understood by them. And that's a mental shift that I encourage you to really spend some time with. Immersive monetization is another force. Okay, immersive monetization, digital twin development. We talked about this before, arbitraging bits and atoms, right? Being able to verify without trust using identity verification NFTs that are interoperable. Rights management, rethinking copyright law, rethinking all these things. There's so many macro shifts underway that it'll be the bumpiest 10 years you've ever seen. But as Gerd Leonhard says, we will have more change in the next 10 years, between now and 2033, than we have in the prior 100 combined. A couple years ago, he said 20 years will have the combined change of the last 300. And I used to always do this bit where I would say, here's a colonial American, husband and wife, and they went to bed last night blew out the candle and pulled a bearskin rug over themselves and didn't have running water in the house. And then they woke up and the iPhone was in their pocket. I mean, imagine how disoriented you'd be if you went through that kind of change. Well, we're gonna. So every time someone tells me there's a bubble, I go, yeah, everywhere. But innovation's not a bubble. Human need is not a bubble. Freedom is not a bubble. So this is the world we're living in. Nothing but opportunity. But we have to understand how to get where we're going. There's another great book I listed up front called Trillions by Mickey McManus and his partners back at the time who invented Maya, which is mostly known for CAD. Many of you have maybe seen CAD or AutoCAD, and they were one of the prolific firms that basically made that a thing. Godfathers of generative design. They wrote a book called Trillions, and in it they talked about where we're going, and they talked about PC Peak, this mountain, PC Peak. That's where we've lived since the 70s. And here's the thing. WEB3 doesn't live in PC Peak. WEB3 lives on Trillions Mountain. But you can't get there from here. So there will be doubt. There will be friction on this path because essentially, just like mountaineering, we have to go down or over from where we are. And we have to build a new base camp, and we're doing that now. And I think that's the phase that we're in. And we have to create a new roadmap to the top of Trillions Mountain. What is Trillions Mountain? It's a world where right now, by 2025, there will be over 1 trillion sensors in the planet. Think about that. That's 200 times more than the number of people. There will be sensors. Now, why does that matter? Because when we talk to each other, we learn, don't we? We learn what we don't like. We learn what we do like, right? What smells good, what smells bad. Make sure I have some gum. All right. But when we talk about machine learning, it's a whole nother level. Because now, everything we're doing, facial recognition, there's sensors everywhere. And these sensors provide certain utility, but they also capture new data, and then they learn from each other and from us. What does this mean? This means we live in an information ecology, not an information age. We are just a node, a data point, a very active one, in a sea, this new layer that we've never had to deal with, this digital sense layer that we've never had to deal with, that literally morphs to our reality at a one-to-one level in real time. And that requires a whole new design architecture for how we code, how we operate, how we do things. And that's Web3. That's the direction we need to go. That's where we need your brains and your talents and your energy and your risk capital, because that's where we lift humanity up at a broader level. All right, it's still early. My final minute. It's still early. I'll let you read these bullets or take a screenshot of them. But the takeaway point here is you are here. You notice that it goes down a little bit before it goes up. That's somewhat of an anecdotal prediction. Things could get worse before they get way better. But don't forget to look at the forest, not from the trees. Have a long-term vision. Look out 3 to 5 to 10 years. Do the math. Challenge the assumptions. And I think what you're going to find is that our best days are still ahead of us. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, guys. I'll leave this up for 30 seconds. Join my whitelist. We're democratizing access to culture around the world. We're bringing people like David Foster into the metaverse, to the Philippines and things like that, through the Nico Theater. So if you want to be on the alert list and whitelist, you can connect with me at my website, or you can scan that QR code and join the whitelist. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you all.
Philippine Blockchain Week See you next year.